Hi, I'm Adrian Strittmatter. Welcome to Bricks and More. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Sentis, a global creative consultancy specializing in destinations, real estate, and the hospitality sector. Bricks and More is all about exploring how to generate, unlock, and maximize real estate value. Our mission is to challenge outdated and limiting notions of how this is done. In each episode, we talk to top professionals to uncover innovative strategies that drive short, medium, and long-term gains. So if you're passionate about making real estate more valuable for more people, you're in the right place. Welcome to Bricks and More. Hi everyone, welcome to the podcast. Today, we'll be covering a value-generating lever, which is, in my biased view obviously, critical to the commercial success of any asset. It is a topic which is both super close to my own interests, career, and work within the real estate sector, but also a source of many of my biggest frustrations, sleepless nights, and yelling at my screen or at a phone once I've just hung up. I'm of course talking about the importance of branding and marketing. To help me overcome my anxieties and provide answers on how to harness the power of real estate brands across the asset lifecycle, I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome Achelle Hill. As the Marketing Director Europe at Lendlease, she has worked collaboratively with business leaders, cross-functional teams, and external partners to shape and deliver high-impact, high-performing B2B and B2C campaigns and initiatives. Her in-depth expertise in marketing communications, placemaking, and leadership has enabled Lendlease to enhance its global reputation, foster customer loyalty, and generate growth opportunities, thus creating exceptional places and experiences that improve the lives of people and communities. Hi, Achelle. Lovely
Hello.
to have you on the podcast.
Lovely to be here.
2025, it's a new year. There's been a couple of sort of really difficult or challenging years for real estate globally. How are you feeling about this new year, this new leaf?
I have to agree with you. The last couple of years have been incredibly challenging, but I'd say with challenge comes reward.
Mm-hmm.
On a very positive note, we are starting to see some really great green shoots. I wouldn't say we're out of the woods just yet. However, a lot of the markers are actually demonstrating that we are moving in the right direction.
What would you say are the top level metrics which are potentially now being hit to provide those green shoots and that glimpse of optimism?
Well, I think what's incredibly interesting is real estate has probably been viewed quite traditionally, and what I'm noticing and what we're seeing, well, at least in the industry, is that some of those measures are changing. And so I work for an organisation called Lendlease. We're a global developer. And some of the foundations and the principles we've applied through our entire history are actually becoming themes, but more than just themes, they're becoming requirements. And those requirements are incredibly valued to actually looking at the value of real estate. So a couple of those, and I think that there's a level of buzz around the word placemaking. Everyone seems to be a placemaker.
Definitely, yeah.
And a value creator, and actually Lendlease, the organisation I work for, actually uses those as their key point of difference and has done for very many decades. But I think in terms of value, it's more than just the bricks and the mortar, or bricks and more. It's around adding social value, environmental value, and then obviously there's a financial value. So I think it's looking at the whole life cycle and the whole spectrum, because we are building places for people. And I think we have to remember at the end of the day, we need to add value more than just the people who are purchasing or transacting, but to the economies and to the communities that we build in.
But that's a really interesting point, actually, because I think you could then sort of view Lendlease of having potentially spotted those trends, or is that just part of the DNA that they had? And that's quite a point of difference of saying these are the things that we're doing pre-buzzwords. Why would you say that, or how is it that they started sort of honing in on those specific levers which have now become not even, well, an obligation, if you want?
So our founder, Dick Dusseldorp, actually believed in a triple bottom line, and he believed that we actually had to add value to our customers and to the internal customers, the employees, throughout the construction and development life cycle. And so I think when you actually look at the places you create and you realize that they're so impactful to the people that will eventually reside in them, but equally the communities you partner with, it gets you to thinking around actually what happens in between these buildings and how do you actually create an experience. And I have to say it was a very key point of difference for us. And I think if you look at our DNA and you look at the projects and you go and experience those projects, you can see that. However, I'd say it's obviously something most other developers are becoming aware of. And they may say they do, but I think those who do it really, really, really well, it's not something that you could add on retrospectively. That has to come through, I'd say, every single part of the business. And then when you actually experience it, you can actually understand how beneficial that is and the legacy it creates.
So I think it's interesting in terms of, I think the motivator, let's say, behind, let's say, ESG is obviously, I would say, context-led and is a kind of a given that has to be done. And you mentioned that it's harder to sort of retrofit that into an organization if it's not part of your DNA. What would you say the reasons are, or potential reasons are, of why people are having or seeing that they're having to adopt these new ways of calculating value, which are not strictly financial, and now obviously with the obligation of doing something for the environment?
I'd say people are realizing that these places have to exist for a lot longer than the initial creation period. And if you're not starting to, I think, give yourself a guiding light or a goal to work towards, and then measuring it along the way and actually being held accountable, I'm not sure that you can necessarily measure the value or you can provide a return on investment to your shareholders or your stakeholders or to the communities in which you work in. So I'd say for us, the people our organisation attracts and the challenges we're given and the goals we're given as individuals within our respective departments or on our projects are incredibly ambitious, but in a really positive, value-driven sense. And I think that that's what drives us to come to work is, yes, we are building buildings and we are creating places, but the fact that we can all stand proud of the places we create for hopefully decades and generations to come.
I think that's super interesting because I think actually we're sort of moving it away from a simple transaction, which is I own something, I'm going to sell it to someone who's going to buy it, to a property or a new area in a city, which actually is formed of multiple transactions between multiple people over a multiplicity of timeframes, and that complexity, and to understand that you are in a, dare I say, a commercial relationship than simply the investor, and that you have to give back to multiple audiences, I think is really key. What I'm really interested in, I think, is the difference that you mention around Lendlease, and I think that we discussed this quickly before about that triple bottom line. How did it come about? I mean, do you know, like, what? Because it's really putting the maths where your mouth is in a weird way.
I'd actually have to go back and chat, obviously, to Dick, but he's no longer with us. Oh. I'd have to I'm not entirely sure on exactly where it came from, but it's most definitely in our DNA. And I'd say one of the key points of difference is the way the business is structured and the opportunities we've created is we don't generally work in individual assets. That's evolving. But a lot of the legacy work that we have done and our strategy has been around taking incredibly large, underutilized locations in key urban locations and recreating part of the city. So I think one of the things that drives us to be able to do that is because we are not working on something individually for a very short period of time. Most of the time, the work that we all do, and we get used to talking in 5, 10, 20-year times, and we're working on Euston overstation development, and there's a running joke internally around who's going to be alive when we finish. And that's the truth of the scale and the time and the longevity. Yeah. And I think that triple bottom line is we are not here for a moment in time. These places are here forever. And I think when you do get the ability to shape really incredibly large places, you are having to consider so much more than just the individual tower itself. It's those spaces in between and what's better for... And I think our business believes if it's better for the world, it can be better for business. And it's in those magic moments where true value is created. And I'd say most of the time it's obviously measured financially, and that's where things can slip, because it's like, but there's a benefit to the community, there's a benefit to the environment, there's a benefit to the people. And I have to say it's incredibly fun to be able to work on something where you know that that place will be an incredible place to come for many, many decades to come.
And I think that's super interesting about that time frame and that adoption of different ways of creating and fostering value. Do you think, obviously you work globally, you're originally from Australia, do you see a difference between how quickly geographies or markets are quick to apply or take on board these new or more inclusive or more diverse ways of looking at value and value creation?
As you mentioned, I'm very, very fortunate having come from our head office and our Australian business. It's an Australian organisation, to head up our marketing here in Europe. One of the things I have to say about working, and I can mainly comment in the UK, is actually as a culture, the focus on social value, maybe less so environmental, I'd say they're probably equivalent, is far stronger in Europe than it was in Australia.
Oh, interesting.
And so some of the things that I thought were quite progressive actually are mainstream here. And I think if you look at the way that we develop our places and you look at the commitments, and I think, you know, in Australia, we were obviously leading the charge and putting out these very bold and ambitious statements and goals, whereas here we're actually held accountable for very ambitious goals, not just by ourselves, but our partners. And so we're seeing that come through with our government partners. But if you look at many of our projects, so from Smithfield and Birmingham to Euston to Silvertown, the commitment we need to make as developers to giving back to the community, whether it's social or affordable housing, is far greater than you would ever see in Australia. And Australia's just starting that journey. So
interesting.
I have to say it's quite progressive here, but that doesn't mean we can actually relax. We actually have to drive it forward. But I think there's a lot we can learn from Australia and vice versa.
Yeah. And then I was mentioning it in my intro that obviously brand and marketing and placemaking is obviously very close to sort of my professional career, and also in the intros I mentioned a lot of my frustrations of not necessarily us as an organization or an agency not having always what I perceive to be the right role in creating these places. In your view, what is, and we'll dive into specific case studies afterwards, the role of brand and marketing in the overall sort of narrative and value creation?
I think I agree with you. Incredibly frustrating. I think if I could create a campaign, and maybe we can do this together, of the value of marketing and real estate, and the fact that we desperately, if this is a cry for help, need to be included earlier. I ask all my
self-help session.
It's a self-help session, it is. But I think the value we create, and I think fortunately or unfortunately, when we get it right, we get it really, really right. And when you don't get it right, you get it wrong. And the thing is, at an individual asset level, it might be okay. But when we're talking about large integrated places where people live, work, play, I've been able to, fortunately or unfortunately, see the whole life cycle of real estate from acquisition all the way to legacy. Now, the role that we play, I think, in a perfect world, is we will need to be brought in up front to say, what's the opportunity here? Who's the customer? Are we designing, are we visioning a place that's actually aligned to our perfect customer? And then I think that obviously there's a whole bunch of value add that you can add all the way through.
All the way.
And I'd say that comes through, obviously, once you actually get to what is the vision, it's the positioning, it's the key messaging, it's the branding, it's the asset branding, it's the partnerships. Fortunately, our team also get to activate the places, drive the footfall. So we also obviously are responsible for closing out those projects and making sure that those legacies are held. So to be honest with you, you can see just in that quick snapshot how much value marketing and brand can add. And I think in collaboration or in partnership with our, I think, suppliers and our partners and our government partners, we can add so much more value back to the development, back to the organisation, and back to the communities in which we work.
And then, so a really interesting point that you mentioned around the longevity and the ability for there to be multiple beneficial brand touch points. Mm-hmm. One key thing is, how do you balance out what kind of short-term gain versus, as you were mentioning, the kind of legacy? Because sometimes, especially in a sort of transactional driven market, people will say, well, I want the marketing to be able to achieve this. And you'll be saying, well, if we do this, we might not have the legacy piece. How are you seeing that balance at the moment in short-term gain versus long-term sort of more legacy gains or value creation?
Well, that's a good one.
Sorry.
And that's a really good one. That's a really good one. I think you can also see my face go, it's because, I guess, in many senses, everything we work on has such a long program or investment. By nature, for the most part, it's very difficult to approach something with just driving pure value. That doesn't mean I don't have to do that, and I do that on a regular basis. But I think the thing is, when we go and we do that, we still have to be very mindful of what's next, what's coming, because it's not immediate. So I think the power of marketing and branding in terms of positioning, driving up value, getting a deal done is very possible. We still do it. But at the same time, I think I have to make sure we still balance all of those other things we talked about. It can't be so short term that we actually deteriorate the value that we are building, or the brands we are building, or the places we're investing long term. So I probably have a slightly different view on it to perhaps somebody else who's in and then out, and then doesn't actually have to pay the consequence of being invested in that location for 2, 5, 10, 20, 50 years. So I'd say marketing can very much help drive that value very, very quickly. But a bit like brand building, I don't think you should leave it to an extreme where you actually start to sacrifice equity long term.
Well, especially if, as you said, the organisation has a longer hold, or is also clearly identified, because we see a lot of people who we work with as well are there for the value add, and then will sell it on to another steward, if it were, who will have to take care of the place. So even in those circumstances, you're right, there should be a thought to what's happening after.
And I think the one thing that we're really lucky with is the value we add and the story we tell is authentic. And that's why I've been with the organisation as long as I have, is what we say we're going to deliver, we deliver. And so it makes my job incredibly, I was going to say easy, but easier when we can demonstrate value in all these different aspects and it's authentic and it's real. And I think the really important thing when it comes to value is feeling like you achieved or perhaps got value, and then making sure that long term you actually feel like that value can increase and grow, rather than was it short term, was it emotional, was it genuine? And I think the one thing that I'm really fortunate about is that we can create value that's sustainable long term and comes from the right place.
And I think to your point as well, and that's why I really like the minute you told me about the triple bottom line, is having a way of actually quantifying it. So your triple bottom line, do you potentially see that in a quadruple or 6 or 7 bottom lines in the future, where that value can, and those metrics? I think a lot of people, especially in marketing, it's the brand equity. I think the minute you've got metrics, it becomes real, it becomes quantifiable in a mathematical sense.
That's a really good question as well. I'd say we've had a triple bottom line approach, I'd say most of or maybe its entire history. But within those, so it's a societal, it's an environmental, and it's a financial. And what's wrapped up in those goes so deep. So I don't know that you necessarily need to expand it to 6 or 7.
6
I think
or 7, okay.
You go underneath that and you go, okay, from an environmental perspective, what are all the different aspects? And then from a societal, what are all the different aspects? And then the financial. And I think as real estate develops, as people develop, and as we change, I think what sits underneath that, or what sits in that, and what we actually measure
in the sub-metrics.
In the sub-metrics, we will change. But I think foundationally, if you actually continue to apply that across the organisation always, and then adjust it based on how trends change, what the priorities are, what the focuses are, I think you have a very strong framework for holding yourself accountable and being able to deliver the value that you promise your shareholders or your stakeholders.
So you've worked on many international developments, and we've had a great conversation around One Sydney Harbour and how that became a real iconic success in so many ways. Could you kind of talk us through how that happened and how sort of marketing and placemaking played a role in that success?
Yeah, that's an incredibly interesting case study, and I'd say probably one of the projects I'm most proud of, having had the opportunity to not only launch it, but to see it through. Mm-hmm. So for those audiences who are not local, One Sydney Harbour is the final residential stage of a precinct or neighbourhood called Barangaroo. It's Lendlease's head office and is one of the most awarded precincts in Australia. Now, it's a predominantly commercial development with amazing retail and only a couple of residential opportunities. Now, it's actually the One Sydney Harbour is actually a collaboration with Renzo Piano and Daniel Goldberg. So it's the powerhouse duo who created the Shard.
The Shard, exactly.
Right,
yeah.
so one of Europe's or London's largest towers. And in terms of value creation and the reason One Sydney Harbour was so successful, and One Sydney Harbour at the time sold the most expensive property in Australia's history. It was the most expensive property that was ever sold off plan, and to date, and I'd probably need a triple fact check, it's been the most successful residential sales launch in Australia's history.
Wow.
So an incredible privilege to be part of that. Incredibly hard work and very steep learning curve, but I have to say thank you to all of the amazing people who worked on the precinct almost a decade before we got to One Sydney Harbour. And it was the value that was created and this defining, city-changing precinct of Barangaroo that allowed us to extract the value out of these residential homes so many years later. And so in terms of the way that, we approached it, obviously we collaborated with incredible agencies to create a really compelling proposition for One Sydney Harbour, which was, I have to say, a delight when you've got master architects like Renzo and Daniel from an interiors perspective. It always helps. But it was really Lendlease's first foray into ultra prime.
Okay.
And in terms of my background, I'm not from ultra prime. I'm a marketeer with a background in finance. So once in a lifetime opportunity under extreme pressure. And it was, how do we create and how do we make sure that we're aligned with a luxury and ultra luxury product and that the customers get an experience as they would with any other high net or ultra high net worth individual. So from a marketing and brand perspective, everything was curated. We had 3 different product types. We had obviously the penthouse, which achieved the record. And we actually set really strong brand values that actually held us to account all the way through. So there was things like rarity, craftsmanship, excellence. And so the brand had been created and the project was meant to launch many years before. And so when I came on board, it was like, how do we take that and how do we create an exceptional customer experience and also make sure that we're also, commercially very, very successful. And so it was this wonderful collaboration and it was very partnership driven to create, obviously, outstanding, resounding success. And so there were so many different things. Obviously, the partnership with Renzo and Daniel was incredibly important. We took a very strong PR approach to making sure that these messages were actually delivered in the right way. And we got, what did we get? We got covers of newspapers. We got every news channel in Australia. We managed to get great coverage. But what I was most proud of was we did brand partnerships with LVMH. We did brand partnerships with furniture suppliers that dealt with only Italian furniture. And we curated experiences. We created very high-end collateral, but we also created a level of scarcity. I probably shouldn't say this, but overall with One Sydney Harbour, there's over 800 apartments. But not that those customers would have seen or known that. So we had a display suite and it was by invite only for almost 2 years.
Oh, wow.
Before we even decided to take any of the marketing onto the market.
So obviously this was One Sydney Harbour was a real commercial success, but obviously, as you mentioned before, part of an established precinct and something that had been worked on and developed over a period of 10 years. So how did that continuation work? How did that sort of evolution work?
So obviously we'd invested very heavily in the Barangaroo brand, and we had commercial brands for our workplaces and a retail destination. And I think when we got to One Sydney Harbour, these towers and the beauty of living there, internally they are spectacular, but it was so much more than what was inside your apartment. And that's where those two brands, and that's where the privilege of working on these master planned projects is because you actually get to promote, celebrate, and we were lucky enough to experience it because it had been developed, is actually the precinct brand and how that actually elevates the product brand, because it's the neighbourhood that you are buying into. And not only had we developed it, we'd curated it. So you've got this amazing high energy precinct on Sydney Harbour, and when it came to the marketing, we often combined those two brands interconnectedly. So you'd often have a brochure that was One Sydney Harbour, and underneath the precinct brand said Barangaroo, because the equity we had built in that location and that precinct and place was second to none within the local and international market.
And you were able to, like you mentioned, sort of, Smithfield in Birmingham, which we're lucky enough to collaborate on, Euston, and there's 7 or 8 big projects in the UK. Is that synergy between, let's call the umbrella brand or the precinct brand, and then the sort of different asset class commercial requirements? Do you have a magic formula for that, or is it always like make it up as you go along, or how is there sort of a way of doing that so it's so successful as you had at One Sydney?
I think we're really, really lucky. Is often before we get brought in, obviously we'd love to be brought in early in terms of like what the customer is, what the opportunity is. I work with incredible individuals who create really ambitious, considered master plans that are not just looking at extracting commercial or financial value. They're actually looking to create new destinations in Smithfield, which we've been able to partner on, which you've done a beautiful job on, and is incredibly exciting. If you actually delve down into that, and it makes my job a pleasure, is the precincts and the visions and the places we create from the outset are world-leading, cutting-edge, progressive, and considered. And so Smithfield has a market, it has a new square, it has a cultural centre. So when you get the opportunity to start telling that story, that authentic story, which obviously you've been part of, the value is created at kind of the inception. And then what's so wonderful is as we deliver that brand, the actual creation of this place matches its value. And then by the time you actually get through the master plan, your brand values and your brand and the place are symbiotic. And then when you get to, most of the master plans here that I work on probably don't accumulate in necessarily an ultra prime residential project. It's not appropriate. But I think what you can see is for the investors, let's say it's off the plan residential, or the workplaces and the occupiers and the people that work there, the value they get in their own investment, in their people, from the retailers, in their businesses, it's so much more than just a really successful launch. It's value for all of the people in all of those transactions, hopefully for a very long time, all the way through. So different types of value in different life cycles, but it remains the same.
Is there anything that, like, over and above like the financial metric? I'm just still thinking around, brand works when other people become ambassadors of that place. They live there, they work there, and they really fuel the word of mouth. Is there anything that in your sort of really vast experience of marketing where you've heard something that someone said, you say, yeah, we got it. Okay. You're hearing people talking about things that you've talked about, but you never told them about it. So they've really embodied the brand and the messaging.
I think it's incredibly interesting to spend time in the precincts you create. And you eavesdrop and you watch.
People watch and eavesdrop.
I think, and I'll have to send you the clip, but when we went to film Renzo and we asked him, what does success look like to you? He says, when a building is finished, I watch the people, I watch the smile on their face. And I think the thing is, you watch the way these places are experienced, and the way that I'm very fortunate to say, oh, have you ever been to Barangaroo, or have you ever been to Darling Square, or have you experienced Elephant Park? And sometimes I won't play my cards and tell them why. It might just come up in conversation, and you hear the feedback. And I think when, your colleagues and friends and family actually live and work in these places, and then you ask them about their experience, that's so rewarding. And I'd say that's why, I'm sure you can sense this, but I'd say a lot of the people that I work with are incredibly proud of the work that we do, and the fact that you'll get to experience those places on those skylines for potentially the rest of your life. And it's a legacy is incredible. But yes, it's not necessarily as direct as what you might experience, but I think it's the indirect is where you actually see the value, because they're being honest.
No, completely. And I think on that note then of experiencing and being in synergy with the way that people experience it, like I think it's when they invented text messaging, it wasn't for the way that people started to adopt that technology. Have you sometimes been surprised in the way that people have engaged with the property in weird and wonderful ways, or with the brand in the ways that you hadn't thought, and were going like, oh, that's actually really interesting?
I'd say it's that people make it their own. And I think that watching the brand collaborations, the placemaking, but it's, you're looking at retailers who have to adopt this. And I think for me, that's the beautiful part, is it is no longer something that you own and curate and manage. It's something that it becomes part of who they are or what they're trying to achieve. And it's seeing their interpretation of it that's incredibly rewarding. And
would you say that's what inspires you to work and to continue to work in this space?
Oh, it's so multifaceted. I think it's, I think it at the heart of it, it's the fact that we do more than just create places. We create places where people thrive. And I think that the opportunities to work on these mega projects, and I think what's really interesting, when I came to the UK, everyone's like, you have the UK's trophy cabinet. And a lot of people get to work on one of those projects in their whole life. I think now I don't want to count, but I'll have the opportunity, within the years that I've been at Lendlease, to work on 10 to 12 and to work on them globally. And that's the part that I think makes a difference. And that's the reason I love what I do.
No, I think that's, and I think the longevity of the product as well. I think that the companies we all work for are shaping the future of the city and the way that people engage with it. Do you think, so it's like a side note maybe, because it's quite topical, but do you think brand and marketing and messaging and positioning has a role in encouraging people to re-engage with spaces, mainly the office, as one of the sort of slightly unloved asset classes? Is there a way of changing social perceptions through brand of how space can be adopted, worked in, or experienced?
I think absolutely. I think we've all gone through such a transformation during COVID. And I think it comes down to, again, the authenticity. I think one of the things, again, is everyone's looking at perhaps workplace in its past life was between the four walls. I think workplaces are now, you need to give someone a really compelling reason to actually come in. And so I'd say brand plays a really big key part. And I think that, looking at the customer, but also it's so much more than just what's inside. And I think if you're creating authentic places to be inside and outside, the ability to retain talent, and to attract and retain occupiers becomes much easier. And it actually demonstrates the value of who you're trying to attract. And so if you were, we talked about our sort of shared frustration at not necessarily being brought in early enough. What would be, it's interesting because you're client side obviously, but what would be maybe your advice to anyone who's looking to, through marketing and branding, enhance the value of their destination or their asset? What would be your sort of, your 5 key points of advice to them, or 3 or 2? How many you want? I have lots. I think there's kind of 2 key parts, and one would be know who your customer is and make sure that you're creating something that speaks to them and adds value to them.
Just jumping in there, do you think that's changed in real estate over the last couple of years, of being less product centric and then discovering that there is actually a customer, especially on the B2B potentially asset classes?
I do think that, and I think that's where there's most opportunity, is build it and they will come. You know, we've gone through COVID and a crisis, and obviously some of the places we're creating and some of the products we're creating have shifted. And I think that if you're not in touch with what the customer wants, or, you know, in terms of workplace, what the end user is actually coming for, then I think that, yes, I think depending on the right market conditions, which, as we've touched on, haven't been necessarily preferable, I think you can get comfortable in thinking that just because you build a good product, it's going to sell, lease, get great value. And I think if we don't look at who we're designing these places for and how the market is shifting and those trends, I think you can be left behind, because I think the difference is we work on things that take a long time. So what's something that is relevant now, and some of the buildings, and that's a challenge we have within development, is, you know, we're building something for a customer in 2-3 years' time. Actually, what are we doing now, and how are we looking forward to make sure that actually when you actually get the keys, or you know, go up the lift in your new workplace, that this is product that's ready for now, not that's ready
that's
for
a bit of a challenge,
3
isn't
years.
it?
And so
especially in such a fast-moving
it's
market
super
context
fast moving, and it's super competitive. However, I think that is something I would remind people of, and I think that we're all guilty of it, is lack of resources, incredible amounts of pressure, but we're not designing places for ourselves. And I think it can be very easy, especially with, you know, in my role, I have so many different stakeholders. I have government, I have internal stakeholders, I have partners, I have suppliers, that it doesn't become what I think or what you think. It's actually, we have to remember we are designing these places for the end user. And if we do that, it's very likely we're going to be far more successful, because they will be adopted, they'll be desirable, and people will want to buy them or lease them or shop there.
Or engage with them over a longer period of time.
Yeah.
So the first point is, definitely, and I would completely agree, is really getting to understand across all asset classes who you're, and even just maybe breaking down the myth of B2B, in the sense that B2B is made up of people who will have different roles within that organization. What would you say the other points, or maybe continuing on that one, which would you say this?
And I'd say, touching on B2B, I think it's quite easy, because in B2B you're talking probably to like minds, but again, there's an end user. I think that needs to be considered in the conversation. But the second part of being most successful is strategy. So, and this is where I plug you guys, is the work that you do. And I'm incredibly diligent, incredibly proud of making sure that our brands are based on really strong strategies. And that means, again, talking to the customer, gaining insights, looking at those trends. And, you know, a couple of the brands that we've created together, some of the work that I've seen in terms of your strategies are second to none. They're world leading, and I can say that having worked on some of the biggest brands and places in key markets. You get that right, the rest will flow, and the creative will flow. And I think the thing that you can get very comfortable in is a creative that doesn't actually stand for something, doesn't have a why. I'm sure your team are used to me asking and challenging that on a regular basis. Unless we can hold ourselves to account and we can actually build these brands in the places and the people of where they come from, they are, I think, easily diluted or challenged. And so I think nail that strategy, nail your brand, nail your creative, and everything should flow from there.
It's interesting because you've got those sort of real key fundamentals. Going to the other sort of more tactical end of the spectrum, is there anything, or any new touch points, or any new technology, or anything that you feel is really going to enhance the work that's done on the brand, the visual creation, but also then the way of deploying that brand? Is there anything that you've really gone like, okay, this is the game changer?
I think it's all of those components. I think the biggest shift is we used to be able to control our own brands. And I think now, if you look at the consumer side of things, is everyone has a voice. Your brand is no longer your brand, it's your customer's brand. And they are speaking for you. And I think one of the things that perhaps we get a little bit comfortable in real estate is we build brands that are not necessarily as cutting edge, and we're not actually activating or building our brands the same way that, you know, and to be fair, most of our customers, depending on their age or their life cycle or what they're looking for, you are competing against much more than just your real estate competitors. So look, I think there's technologies, I think there's AI, I think that's going to very much shift the way that we do work. I still think that the creative process, working with really good people, collaborating, being mindful of who your audience is, won't be taken. But I do think that, TikTok, Instagram has shown that brands are now owned by the people who invest and love them. And I think, we work on places. And so I think you're probably like, how is that relevant to someone who's doing a transaction on an office block? But I'm always thinking about the people in between. So we have people who shop with us, live with us, work with us. What else do they? They lease with us.
And they are entertained
by
spaces,
us.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we take real estate as a B2B brand, whereas I see real estate going all the way down to B2C brands. And it's the choice of where you and I, either as friends, go grab a cup of coffee, or when we're working, where are we perhaps going to grab lunch? And I think the fortunate part is I'm creating brands and creating opportunities that mean that I'm responsible and accountable for each one of those decisions and moments.
A lot of the value is created when a lot of people have the ability to engage with a brand, engage with a place. Does that mean that a lot of the work that you do happens in partnerships, and how do you manage those partnerships? Because we know that there's the old adage of too many cooks spoil the broth, I think it is.
Yeah.
So how do you manage and engage with those partnerships to really create that long-term value?
I'd say at an organisational level and development level, most particularly in the UK and Europe, is everything's based on partnerships. And so we have, I think when I worked on the Euston brand, it was my first week in Europe, working on a place brand for Euston.
Deep end.
Deep end. And I was like, I've worked on Barangaroo. I've delivered number of integrated developments.
Got this.
I've got this. Yeah, sure. Just, give me a quick brief. And I sat down with one of my colleagues and she said, okay, not only do we have to create this brand and get everyone on board, you have 21 sets of stakeholders to get this through. And I went,
wow,
dear me, excuse me, I don't even know where I'm living or where I am. And I'm going to take on one of the UK's most prominent sites and make sure it's successful and it gets through. So hopefully we're not far away from launching that place brand, where I'm incredibly proud of. We've got green lights all the way through, much like Smithfield, I have to say. And that's, again, a really great strategy, really great partnership. But partnership, again, one of the things I said to my team, I have a very lean team, I have an incredible team, is we don't need to start from scratch. What can we do by partnering with subject matter experts or people who already have the audiences or insights? How do we actually partner with that to maximize our success? And a couple of I'm going to obviously talk about some of the things I'm most proud of since I've been here is in Stratford, we have a project called Stratford Cross. When I came on board, the name, it wasn't that. It didn't describe the opportunity, and we were kind of talking about ourselves around what's the opportunity in this, and it's in this heart of key locations between Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, Westfield and here East. And it was like, we are next door to one of the UK's newest cultural destinations. I have some of the world's biggest brands sitting on my doorstep. Nothing I say or do is ever going to compare to the value that those organisations have. And, we've got constraints of money and time. And one of my goals in repositioning and renaming this precinct, and actually all the activation and the positioning of this place, is it's not about us. It's about what you as an organisation or an individual can get by collaborating with, so it's East Bank or QEOP, and some of the things from a marketing point of view that we've done in the last year. We worked on GDIF, Greenwich Docklands International Festival, relocated it for Canary Wharf, partnered with East Bank, QEOP. We had 15,000 people on site, and I could never, through an activation of that size or scale with a budget I had, achieve those results. Full press media coverage, incredible energy, and those are the things.
And they were happy to participate in doing that as well then. So that's great.
Oh, well,
so
I think
to foster the partnership.
Well, I think the thing is, underneath it is, if you find like-minded people, and I have to give full credit to QEOP, they started a group called Park Partners. And, I'm probably the most commercial individual in that community. But man, am I invested. And, you know, I turn up and we have conversations with Tasman Ace, and she's a director of East Bank. And we are constantly looking at ways that we can utilise their creativity and their passion to co-benefit. And so I'd say to anyone who's probably in the situation where many of us are, we need to create incredible value, incredible outcomes with constantly challenging resource constraints and budgets. Is how do I actually pick up the phone, have a conversation, and how do we actually combine our resources? And one of the terms that one of our projects in Milan called Mind uses quite openly is we collaborate to compete. And I think sometimes that you can...
It's a good one.
Yeah, it's a great one.
Yeah, it's a good one.
It takes a minute to go, you're going to collaborate to compete. But I think the thing is, sometimes our objectives are actually collective. I think it was only last week, Time Out listed Stratford the second most key place to visit in London. And I'd say, I mean, there's some pretty big brands.
That's a paradigm shift.
That is a paradigm shift. I'm not going to comment on that. I've been here not long enough. But I think the thing is, if you look at that and you'd say the efforts of QEOP, the efforts of East Bank, and I'd say there's, you know, Westfield and, you know, small mighty people in between, the here East, that we now tell a cohesive story. We check each other's collateral. We cross-promote. We turn up at each other's events, and, you know, because we are speaking collectively, we have the power to shift perception, but we also have the opportunity to really deliver on and deliver outcomes well in excess of what you would expect working in isolation.
Achelle, that's an amazing conclusion to what's been a really delightful conversation. Thanks ever so much for coming on the podcast. And
thank you.
There's some great nuggets of knowledge in there.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Bricks and More. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a colleague or friend who would appreciate it. If you're not already, connect with me on LinkedIn, whether to say hello or discuss a destination, real estate, or hospitality project of your own. Finally, please rate the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Again, share the episode, connect with me on LinkedIn, and rate the podcast. I'm Adrian Strittmatter, and I'll be back soon with the next episode.